Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing fabulously well. And don't forget to go and get that quintessential drink, whatever it is, whether it's a spicy drink or whether it's something warm and comforting. Go and get it, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And remember, I love hearing from you. It's always fascinating to learn whereabouts in the world you're from or what you're drinking tonight, whether it's something very unusual. And I just want to say I really appreciate your feedback. It's fabulous hearing from you. So thanks for that. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I was about 10 years old at the time. Me and my best friend Nathan Wheeler were throwing old soda cans at the X marking we'd drawn on the sizable girth of a large oak tree in the woodgrove that flanked the houses on the opposite side of the street, which was, I suppose you could say, our quintessential bullseye for our game. It felt good to slam the trunk with a pile of tin cans we'd collected, as hard as we possibly could, with a focus on hitting our target every time. It was a great deal of fun. Well done, Nathan, I conceded. You're a much better shot than I am. Hello there, came a steely male voice. How you boys doing? We both turned around to see Dwayne Engelman walking up the embankment towards us with a bright sunny smile on his face. Lovely day, isn't it? We nodded. I was exceedingly surprised that Dwayne Engelman was even showing us the time of day. Over the last couple of years, he'd usually given us a brief cursory indifferent nod in passing, but never really afforded us a fleeting second glance. Yet it seemed on this morning his attention was almost fixed on us. What did he want, I wondered? Why was he being so unusually friendly? My mother described Dwayne as a good-looking man with a distinctive handlebar moustache. I suppose he did fit the female stereotype of good looks, as he was tall, dark and handsome, but that is in a woman's eyes, not mine. However, if you were a woman who despises ear piercings and sailor ink tattoos, then Dwayne would certainly not be your type. So perhaps it would be better to say he was an acquired taste. I think women might have liked him because he had a bad boy image, was rather rough around the edges. He was a man in his 30s with a full head of dark hair that he wore spunked up in a vertical triangle, rather like a pointed mountain peak. His hair always looked as if it had been deliberately sculptured with a plethora of hair gel. My guess was he must have got through hundreds of bottles of the sticky stuff every single week. He had 2 big ear piercings in his earlobes, the size of miniature coins, 2 studs on his tongue, and 1 circular earring in his nostril. He also had a large tattoo of an eagle on his chest, which he always showed off to maximum effect by wearing his black cotton top wide open so that you couldn't fail to see the fabulous work of art displayed on his tan chest underneath the heavy gold chain he always wore. As young boys, we thought his illustrious tattoo pretty cool, but we knew our parents would never allow us to get permanently inked ourselves. Dwayne always wore black, a studded black belt, black Levi jeans, and always a black cotton top. I don't recall him wearing anything else but black. I think he liked the dramatic look. So what are you boys doing? He asked us awkwardly, his black combat boots kicking up the dirt, while his eyes remained anchored to the ground, as if he found the earthen floor a source of great interest. This was really gross, audacious behaviour, I thought secretly to myself. A 30-year-old man feigning an undisguised interest in hanging around a couple of 10-year-olds that were young enough to be his own kids, like a real social outcast. Had things got so thin, flimsy, fractured for him, I wondered, on the friendship stakes, that he needed to hang around with us? With a father as obnoxious and objectionable as Mr. Engelman, it seemed more than a little likely. It would be a nightmare, I thought to myself, having to play with someone as old as Dwayne Engelman, who was easily in his 30s. We're just hitting the tree, I exclaimed, trying to conceal my rising level of irritation. Why would the annoying man not just leave us alone? I can see that, said Wayne, giving us a mock applause with his hands, as if we'd performed some sensational, never-to-be-repeated act. The dude was seriously weird, I thought. We were only hitting tin cans at a tree, for goodness sake. Wayne looked at us directly through his beady brown eyes. I have a job for you, How would you boys like to earn some really good money?" At this our interest piqued, especially as I was saving up for a mountain bike. My available savings were pitiful. Perhaps Dwayne wasn't so weird after all. He was offering us a legitimate job, and good jobs were in short supply around here. I did manage to get a job at home washing my parents' trucks, cleaning windows for them, but my parents were never lavish with their payouts for these gallant efforts on my part that were deserving of far greater reward, even if I say so myself. I mean, I got my mother's truck literally gleaming, so much so that it sparkled like a glittering diamond. And as for the house windows, there wasn't a smudge in sight. They sparkled, they were so clean, that even the sunlight bounced off the windows in a golden glaze. I had secretly hoped that going out on a limb to do such an exceptional job would in fact earn me a greater wage, but sadly, despite my very best efforts, that was clearly not the case. I told myself after all that exhausting, back-breaking work that caused me to literally bust a gut, that the next time my mother wanted her truck washed, I wouldn't go that extra mile on her account. I'd do a mediocre substandard job for a mediocre pay. After all, fair's fair. You get what you pay for. Isn't that what they always say? "What kind of a job?" I asked. "Doing exactly what you're doing now, throwing things. But this time I don't want you to throw them at a tree. I want you to throw them at my father's house." "But why?" I asked, looking at Dwayne's solemn, resolute face in bewilderment. Maybe the man was a crackpot after all. No one would willfully choose to throw things at their own house, would they? "Why would you want us to throw stuff at your own home?" I asked. "Because my dad is not a good person. He deserves to be harassed. I want to see that smile of his knocked off his smug, self-satisfied, pompous face." "I'm not sure," I said, shrugging my shoulders awkwardly. "Can't you ask someone else to do this job? You see, it's a kind of job that could land me in a heap of trouble. My father could ground me for an entire month if he found out about this. My dad can be pretty strict. If he knew I was pelting your house, he would be very upset with me." "I'll pay you handsomely. I'll also provide the tin cans, the plastic bottles, eggs, tomatoes, horse, cow manure to throw at his house. We can think of all kinds of lovely things to throw at it. You'll find it a lot more exciting than throwing cans at an old tree. A hell of a lot more exciting." "I do feel bad for your father," I said. "I know no one likes him, but is it not wrong to just vandalise his property like this?" Dwayne looked at us pensively. "If I tell you that I think my father was responsible for pushing my mother down the stairs, would that change anything for you? Could I then persuade you to change your minds?" "But didn't your mum fall down the stairs?" I asked. "Wasn't her death a tragic accident?" "Oh, no, I don't think so. Not for a moment. Of course, I have no proof in the matter, but I do have my suspicions." "That's terrible," I said, wrinkling my brow in horror. "If your father pushed your mother down the stairs, that would make him a murderer." "My point exactly," said Wayne. "Now, do murderers deserve to be walking around town, doing as they please? I ask you that." Me and Nathan shook our heads vigorously. No, he doesn't deserve to be free. He should be locked up. He should be imprisoned for life." "My point exactly. If you start throwing things at his house, it'll be a small way of putting him in his place, don't you think? You'll be doing everyone in town a big favour. If the law isn't going to do the job thoroughly, at least you can do something constructive against him." "He's right, Emmett," said Nathan. "Mr. Engelman isn't a good man. He deserves to be punished. If the law won't do it, we should do it." "Good," said Dwayne, looking very pleased. "That's settled then. I will let you know when you can pelt his house with the stuff, so that he never catches you in the act. I will know all his chess moves, as I live with him myself. So if he calls the sheriff on you, you'll be long gone. Is that a good deal?" We nodded. The idea of throwing turd at a murderer's house didn't sound halfway so bad. After all, he was only getting what he deserved. Better still, we were getting paid for the trouble. Dwayne was basically right. It would be infinitely more exciting than hurling cans at a tree. Besides, that mountain bike was lingering on the horizon. It was literally winking at me. Everyone in our small American town knew what a piece of work Mr. Engelman was, for he walked around the town with a perpetual scowl on his face. If you spoke to him, he rarely ever smiled. Even the way he thundered down the streets in his cowboy boots, swinging his arms viciously in a forward march with such an aggressive get-out-of-my-way stance, left much to be desired. It was hardly a wonder when his wife was alive. She always walked with her arm nervously clasped in his, looking so downcast, despondent, gloomy. Her brown eyes almost looked frightened, while she'd hurriedly tried to keep up with her husband's fast pace, as by contrast to him she was petite, slight, tiny, so her stride was very small. If she was slow, Mr. Engelman's booming voice would snap at his wife. "Goodness sake, Eva! Get a move on! We haven't got all day." My mother said that Mr. Engelman washed away his wife's joy like a powerful laundry detergent on a very hot wash that had left her faded, worn, and simply washed out. My sympathetic mother always extended an invitation for his wife Eva to join her for the book clubs and tea parties. Yet when Eva arrived at these all-woman functions, she would slink away in the shadows, finding an obscure place to hide, and you would barely notice she was there at all. It was like she was a terrified mouse who liked to view the world through the safe confines of her little burrow, as she positively abhorred any kind of social interaction. I suppose it didn't come as much as a surprise that there was no love lost between Mr. Engelman and his son Dwayne, for they were polar opposites in every regard. He wanted Dwayne to become an accountant or a banker, a sensible, reliable job that would earn him great respect in the community. But it would seem his son had become a source of great disappointment to him. At school in his younger days, Dwayne's grades had left much to be desired. But getting an E for math, well, that had always got Mr. Engelman very hot under the collar. It had been an ultimate source of humiliation for him. No one in his genetic bloodline should have got an E for math, not when his father and grandfather before him had been exceptionally good with figures. What on earth was wrong with his son? Wayne was a total embarrassment to him. Everything about his son really annoyed him. One of the things that bothered him the most, that much like his late wife, his son loved to draw. Mr. Engelman saw nothing good about putting pen to paper, unless it was to work out a mathematical equation. As far as he was concerned, drawing for a man made his son a total wuss. Worse still, his boy wanted to run his own tattoo and body-piercing parlour. It didn't get more embarrassing than that for Mr. Engelman. He had high expectations for his son, but then again with a son that got an E for math all the way through high school, it was clear he was hardly going to be running any corporate enterprise any time soon. And as for becoming an aspiring accountant or banker, well, that was never going to happen. But a tattoo parlour? Please, God help him! How could he hold his head up high again with any form of dignity in town, especially with a son who looked like his hair had been struck by lightning, while miniature flying saucers from space had somehow landed in his earlobes, and drawing pins had somehow lodged themselves into his tongue like the staples from a staple gun. Of course he blamed his wife for all of this. She came from a long line of artists with what he would only describe as seriously flawed DNA. He should have checked her family line long before asking her to be his wife. He knew that now. If only he'd married someone a little savvier, shrewd and sharp-witted, who was sagaciously good with numbers, he would have a son that was going places right now, a son that people would look upon with respect and wondrous awe. People in town would say, "There goes Mr. Engelman's son. Do you realise how important he is? I gather he's the top CEO of the Bank of America, or J.P. Morgan Chase." Mr. Engelman's had always loved the idea of basking in his son's success like a crocodile on a sunny rock. But with a son like Dwayne, he'd rather crawl into a burrow like a rabbit and hide. Unfortunately, his son had an excellent portfolio of designs that had enabled him to acquire a job as an apprentice in a tattoo shop, but he was far from happy about Dwayne going down this path. He had expressed his disapproval, made his feelings known by undermining his son all the time with insulting, condescending remarks. Everyone in town had known about how much Mr. Engelman disapproved of his son's choice of career. If that had not been bad enough, his silly wife Eva had encouraged Dwayne all the more. "Oh, Dwayne, you're so talented," she'd say. "You're such an incredible artist." Mr. Engelman physically shuddered at the memory of his effusive wife's rapturous commentary about Dwayne's work. Goodness gracious, woman, he'd thought. Stop encouraging the boy. When Dwayne had decided he wanted to run his own tattoo shop, his loopy wife had been on board with the idea. She thought it was absolutely wonderful. I'm going to give you all the money your grandmother left me in her will, so that you can run your own tattoo shop. Mr. Engelman was absolutely enraged. How could his wife do such a ridiculous thing, throwing good money to source such a preposterous profession that no one in their right mind would take seriously, unless they wanted to procure an insidious acting role on Pirates of the Caribbean? When it came to his wife, Mr. Engelman knew he had her under his thumb. Well, most of the time that was. But when it came to her son Dwayne, it was a whole different ballgame, as that annoying wife of his became as tough as old nails towards him, when it came to defending, protecting, guarding the honour of her beloved son, the quintessential apple of her eye, who could do no wrong in her sight. Now that she was dead, Dwayne would not be getting a single penny of that money for a tattoo parlour, as his wife's money was now nestling very happily in his bank account, thank you very much, and would likely be hatching chickens as the interest increased in the years to come. A real little nest egg for Mr. Engelman. He felt very happy about that. He couldn't help himself from allowing a little smug smile to emanate from the corners of his thin lips, like a victorious victory flag. As for his wife, that silly woman had irritated him all his married life. Frankly, having her out of the way wasn't a bad thing at all, he thought. Dwayne's account. I was so angry with my father. I despised the man, because he was a real bully. The kind of person that wasn't happy if you didn't do things his way, according to his exacting standards. It had been that way all my life. He had that superior attitude, as if he always knew best. He would even interfere with my mother in the kitchen. "You're not supposed to slice the chicken like that." "No, you can't put sugar in that sauce." My father never abused my mother, but he undermined her all the time. He was a perpetual bully, but she would draw the line if my dad said anything about me, as my mother stood up for me like a protective mother hen, guarding her brood. From the day I was born, I had been a perpetual disappointment to my father, especially as he was hoping to gain bragging rights on me. His hopes for my becoming a perfect reflection of himself had sadly gone awry. My mother's death had been devastating for me. She was my greatest cheerleader, encouraging me to pursue and go after my dreams. But now I had to live with my cantankerous, grumpy old dad, without her presence in our home, and that was exceedingly hard. I should have left home a long time ago, but now I was stuck at home for the foreseeable future. I had been saving to buy myself a tattoo parlour. I couldn't waste my valuable earnings on board and lodgings, so I was stuck living with my dad. These days I worked as an apprentice for Joe McCullen, but I was a better artist than he was. He even admitted as much. People visiting the parlour were eager to choose me to do their tattoos, as they knew the quality of my work was absolutely excellent. Was my mother's death an accident? I couldn't be sure. Could my father have pushed her down the stairs? It was a distinct possibility, but not a certainty. But it was awfully convenient that my mother was no longer capable of writing me a cheque. So my dreams to run my own tattoo parlour had been conveniently nipped in the bud. They'd dwindled away. By, of course, my mother's untimely death. Now my father had his sharp, greedy claws on her money. I knew that he was not going to give me a single penny. Of course, I had asked him, but he just barked at me. "Your mother could be a biased fool as far as you're concerned. Granted, if she was here, I admit you would get your pathetic tattoo parlour, but not on my watch. I'm not going to see good money go plunging down the drainpipe." "But it wasn't your money in the first place," I'd piped. "It was hers. She wanted me to have it." "Well, it's not hers now, is it, son?" "It's mine," said my father, giving me a malicious grin. "You're not getting a single penny of it, son. You think I'm going to lash out perfectly good money for people to become painted with dragons using ink, and to have every single available orifice of theirs pierced? Credit me with a little bit more intelligence, will you, son?" I knew there was no arguing with my father. I could feel the indignant anger rising up in my gut. I knew I wanted revenge. I wanted my father to pay for dishonouring my mother's wishes, and furthermore for taking such pleasure in doing so in the first place. It was when I was walking out of my front door to drive into town that I saw the two kids over the road throwing cans at a tree. And that was when the crazy idea was born. I'd get them to throw stuff at my father's house. As I suspected, it had worked a charm. Several nights during the week my father's house had been assaulted with hundreds of eggs. Then it was cow manure, rotten tomatoes, dreadfully ugly fruit. It had been a nightmare for him to try and wash off the eggshell from his windows that seemed to stick there like superglue. My father was furious, as he was a perfectionist, so having to remove all this gunk from his house was appalling. But the red graffiti paint on his front door that said murderer, that was the final straw for him. I could see the regular assaults on our home had seriously unsettled my father. I was so happy to see the smug, self-satisfied look vanish from his face. I really hoped I was scaring him. I had slashed all 4 tyres on his truck myself, and that had brought me a great deal of satisfaction. Of course, I hadn't been surprised to see the sheriff arriving at our home, having been called over to the house by my frantic father. Like most of the people in town, Sheriff Theodore Quinn did not warm to my father at all. I watched him reluctantly climb out of his police truck and amble slowly over to my father. His normal confident authoritarian stride seemed to convey a subdued, wary reticence. It was clear he was not looking forward to his encounter with my cantankerous, crusty dad. "What is all this about, Mr. Engelman?" asked the sheriff, taking out his pad and pen to scribble down some notes. "Some ghastly kids in town are assaulting my home, Sheriff, with tomatoes, rotten fruits and eggs. And if that isn't bad enough for you, Sheriff, I've had dog turds slip through the mailbox, horse manure walloped against my house, plastering the white paint with filthy smudges that I can't get off, unless I do a repainting job over the whole house. They've even had the blazing audacity to slash my tyres and to write on my door with graffiti paint. What are you going to do about it, Sheriff?" "Who do you think is doing this to you, Mr. Engelman?" asked the sheriff. "Well, someone who's clearly got a grudge against me." The sheriff grimaced. I knew exactly what he was thinking. No one likes you, Mr. Engelman. The whole town has a grudge against you. But he wisely never said a word. "Have you upset anyone recently, Mr. Engelman?" "I'm always upsetting people, Sheriff," snapped my father. "People around here are far too sensitive. They take things very personally." The sheriff raised a quizzical brow. "Well, in the light of what you're telling me, Mr. Engelman, you must have upset someone a lot. Look, we'll patrol your street at night more regularly. Short of that, there's not much we can do until we catch the children ourselves." "I might have known it, Sheriff Quinn. You people are bloody useless, the whole damn lot of you. These kids need to be arrested for vandalising my home, and you're not doing a damn thing about it. Because, as I was telling you, Mr. Engelman, we don't know who's doing this to you. If we did, we would talk to the kids, find out what's going on, why they've chosen to lash out at your home. But, Sheriff, slashing my tyres is not acceptable, or spraying murderer on my front door in blazing red paint. Now that is just unacceptable." "Oh," said the sheriff, raising a brow. "Now that isn't good." I grinned ecstatically to myself. My dad was getting exactly what he deserved. As far as those 2 kids were concerned, Emmett and Nathan were doing an outstanding, sterling job in harassing and vandalising his home. He wouldn't even guess in a million years that his own son was behind these insidious pranks. Emmett's account. The sooner I learnt about the real possibility that Mr. Engelman might have something to do with his wife's murder, the more justified I felt in lashing out at Mr. Engelman by pelting his home. After all, he deserved all the harassment. He wasn't a nice man. Nobody in town liked him. When people heard about Mr. Engelman's house being egged and tomatoed by a bunch of hooligans, I was more than delighted to take credit for our awesome job, although naturally I never said a word. Even my mother had said, "Well, I can't say he doesn't actually deserve it. The man's not a nice character. Who knows if his wife's death was really an accident? That man ruled his household with an iron rod. Poor, poor Eva. My heart goes out to her. Bless her soul. What she must have gone through living under his roof with his hot temper and disagreeable disposition." So it seemed that even the locals in town had their lingering doubts about Mrs. Engelman's death, and whether it had been an accident or not. Still, the coroner had found no reason to suspect the man, so then why should we? In my mind's eye, I was sure he'd pushed his wife over the stairs, and so I felt virtuous, just like Robin Hood, valiantly doing a gallant mission that would bring the miserable man to his knees. It had felt incredibly good being given bountiful cartons of eggs, tomatoes, rotting fruit, horse, dog and cow turd, and all other kinds of unmentionables to throw at Mr. Engelman's house. It was on a Friday night. Dwayne had given us the all-clear to pelt his father's house again by giving our in-house phone 3 rings, as in the 1990s we didn't have cell phones. My mother was getting very frustrated that someone was calling us in the middle of the night by ringing the phone 3 times. "It's some kids having a laugh," my father had assured her. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning when me and Nathan surreptitiously crept out of our houses. We lived on a very pretty street lined with oak trees, with wide front yards of viridescent green grass, scatterings of fruit trees and manicured beds of pretty flowers. All the houses weren't far apart from each other, in what you might have described as ranch-style properties. There was a sprawling wood grove, consisting of maples, oaks and dogwoods, that fringed the houses on the upper corner of the street. This included the Engelman property, Nathan's house, and of course mine. I'm glad to say that it had never been bulldozed to make way for more houses, but was used by the locals in the area for dog walks. It was a place where Nathan and I would while away the long summer days, playing to our heart's content in the woods. Our parents were blindly oblivious to our nighttime soirees. I was able to climb out of my bedroom window discreetly, when my alarm clock, given to me by Dwayne, woke me up at the perfect time with a gentle beeping tone that didn't awaken the entire household, which consisted of my 2 older sisters and both my parents, who always remained fast asleep as I wiggled out of the window. I quickly put on my black jeans and matching hoodie, as Dwayne had insisted that dressing in black and wearing a hoodie would make us a lot less conspicuous and help us to disappear into the background so that we wouldn't be seen by his father. I felt the usual buzz of excitement as I crept out of the house. My heart was beating in my chest with an exuberant expectation, my legs trembling with eagerness. Who would have thought that pummeling someone's house with tomatoes would feel this good? Dwayne had drawn the line at throwing glass bottles at the house, for fear that someone could potentially get hurt. I realised that doing something high risk where you had the potential of getting caught only added to its appeal. I also felt justified vandalising Mr. Engelman's property. If anything, I was issuing out a punishment that the law had failed to procure on the belligerent, self-righteous man who may well have murdered his own wife. In truth, me and Nathan were heroes of the night, extracting justice where it belonged. The very act of throwing stuff at Mr. Engelman's house was in itself 1,000 times better than throwing tin cans at an old oak tree. Furthermore, what did the oak tree do to deserve to be pummeled like this? But Mr. Engelman deserved every rotten tomato that we threw at his house. A cool breeze was blowing against my face as I met up with Nathan behind the large hedgerow on the edge of Mr. Engelman's property. We were both wearing torches on our heads, although it was indeed a brilliant night, where the moonlit shadows danced from the sky, lighting up the front yards of the homes along our street. "Oh, there you are," whispered Nathan. "You're late. Are you ready?" I nodded. He pointed to the softening tomatoes and pawpaws that were stacked up in huge boxes, giving off a whiffy, fruity smell, along with a couple of garbage bags filled with stinking refuse that had been stealthily hidden behind a large bush. We read the note from Dwayne. "Please scatter the refuse across the lawn, then throw the fruit at the windows." We eagerly grabbed the garbage bags that were filled with decomposing filthy material and wiggling nasty maggots. We scattered the contents liberally across Mr. Engelman's lawn. I almost gagged, it was so revoltingly disgusting, as the gooey garbage clung to the turf like rampant chewing gum, while the maggots wiggled across the grass. Then we began to launch our attack on Mr. Engelman's home. I felt like a soldier at war, launching an ambush on an enemy camp, doing a mission of the uttermost importance for the good of humanity. All of a sudden we heard an excitable squealing sound. I say excitable because the resonance of the sound reminded me of a giggling, thrilled child, and that was when we saw him. He came bounding out of the dark shadows like an excitable, oversized, rambunctious, soppy puppy dog. We'd not even heard his approach, but this big 4-foot bundle of hair made a nosedive at the fruit. He exuberantly joined us in pelting Mr. Engelman's windows with a fervent enthusiasm. He clearly thought that this was a really exciting game, of which he wanted to play an intrinsic part. Every time a rotten tomato went flying to Mr. Engelman's windows and dribbling down the glass panes, the creature, whatever in God's name it was, let out a thrilled whoop. Whoop! Whoop! As he jumped up and down on his human-like legs. He was so comical, his enthusiasm for throwing the tomatoes infectious. So laughing we joined in, pondering in our heart what this strange creature could possibly be. It looked so human, but it clearly wasn't. It was covered in hair, was 4 foot tall, with a bullet-shaped head, human face, overlong arms. I could see a silhouette of a figure standing in the tree line watching us. It was enormous, a creature easily doubly the size of the one standing next to us. I knew almost at once it must have been the mother of this strange, incongruous, hairy humanoid that was clearly her little youngling, whom she was allowing to play with us. She hid in the dark shadows, watching her youngling having the time of his life. She didn't seem to mind he was interacting with a couple of human kids. He eyed us through his sparkling brown eyes, as if to say, "Go on, aren't you going to keep throwing tomatoes? Why have you stopped?" We'd only stopped our throwing because the strange human-looking creature, covered in hair, had grabbed our attention. We were studying him curiously, with a wondrous awe and intrigue. The creature made our tomato-throwing look absolutely pathetic. When he launched his red missiles, they crushed against the glass so violently hard that the panes on Mr. Engelman's windows began to break all over the place. Crack! 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 The next thing we knew is that Mr. Engelman's bedroom light came on, then the lights of his front porch. Finally, the front door swung open. I could see the pugnacious, bellicose man bolting out of the house, carrying a baseball bat in his hand that he was holding up in a striking position, as if waiting to beat the living hell out of the perpetrators. "Who's out here?" he screamed. "I've had enough of you bloody kids pounding the windows, breaking them. You've gone too far now." I could see the large creature disappearing into the woods, responding to the sounds of his mother's earnest whistle, who, on seeing Mr. Engelman storming around the yard, had obviously decided to call back her youngling. He looked so desperately disappointed as he left, but glided away, grabbing a couple of pawpaws as he went. I don't know why, but the comical creature breaking all the windows had been so desperately funny to watch, that despite the booming voice of the angry Mr. Engelman, me and Nathan were doubled over in laughter and almost wetting ourselves in the process. We tried to run away, but our giggles seriously impeded and hampered our progress. Our legs did not gain much momentum. You could say we were inebriated by the humour of what had just transpired, for the powerful creature, oblivious of his own strength, had not only successfully succeeded in pulverising the fruit into a messy sludge, but broken all Mr. Engelman's windows, and broken glass was scattered absolutely everywhere. The next thing I knew was that Mr. Engelman grabbed me. As I was running away, he pulled off the hoodie from my head, while Nathan managed to successfully escape. He looked confounded when he saw my guilt-ridden crimson face. "Emmett Jensen! I can't believe it's you! Of all the potential young hooligans in our neighbourhood, you were the last person I ever imagined would do this to me. Wait until your parents hear about your atrocious behaviour." He dragged me by the scruff of my neck, marching me towards my parents' house to face the ultimate humiliation at about 3 o'clock in the morning. As you can imagine, I was in a whole heap of trouble. My father came down on me like a bulldozer, grounding me for well over a month. I'd never seen my parents so angry before. My father was practically breathing fire. He said he'd never felt so ashamed and disappointed in his entire life. "I didn't raise you, Nathan, to become a vandal. What the hell do you think you were doing, throwing stuff at Mr. Engelman's windows like that?" "I'm sorry, but he deserved it. Everyone knows he murdered his wife." "That's not true," my father said. "His wife fell down the stairs. It was an awful accident." "He needs to be punished," I said. "Son, you're not judge, jury, and executioner," said my father. "You have no right to behave like this. I am very, very ashamed of you. Who put you up to this?" "No one," I lied. I had no intention of snitching on my best friend, nor the hairy humanoid in the woods, or even on Dwayne Engelman himself. "Where did you get all these rotten tomatoes and pawpaws from?" "I found them." "Who was helping you? Was it Nathan?" "Of course not. I did this all on my own," I lied. Suffice to say, even the sheriff had some stern words for me, assuring me that regardless of the way I felt about Mr. Engelman, I had no right to vandalise his property. "But he murdered his wife! Someone had to do something!" "The case is closed, son," said the sheriff. "It was an accident." But he said this with hesitancy in his voice, as if he secretly wondered whether I might just be right. Needless to say, I was expected to pay for all the damages done to Mr. Engelman's windows caused by the hairy creature. I was also expected to help him with yard work around his home to make up for what I'd done, and to cover the costs of the slashed tyres, along with the paint for his front door and the broken windows. So it was a long while before I got that mountain bike that had been winking at me in my dreams. All these years later, I realised the comical creature I encountered that night was a Bigfoot. Dwayne was exceedingly grateful that I never snitched on him to his father. When I turned 15, he opened his own tattoo parlour in town. I gather with the help of a lawyer, he managed to get the funds from his father to buy his own parlour. Everyone could see that Mr. Engelman was not happy that his son had become a tattoo artist, but in the end, he had to grit his teeth and bear it. Dwayne invited me and Nathan to be the first to have a free tattoo. We had to hide the evidence from both our parents, so we both had a dragonfly done on our lower hips. Whenever I look at it, I think of that playful Bigfoot that wanted to join us in our game, because obviously now I know it was a Bigfoot that we encountered. I only wish we could have seen him again. He was such a cheerful, congenial creature. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what a fabulous story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.